Imagine a silent epidemic sweeping through our offices and factories, completely undetected. Well, back in the 1980s, a Swedish psychologist named Heinz Lehmann uncovered a genuinely shocking statistic. He estimated that a staggering 12% of suicides in Sweden were directly linked to a hidden, systemic kind of psychological trauma. And get this, it wasn't suffered at home, but right there in the workplace.
Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving deep into an invisible, contagious, and frankly devastating threat that's hiding in everyday work environments. We are going to break down the anatomy of a workplace epidemic known as mobbing. Relying on the groundbreaking research of Heinz Lehmann and the scholars who followed in his footsteps, we're going to uncover exactly how it starts, why it happens, and the truly tragic toll it takes. So, I want to start by asking you a question, and I want you to really think about it for a second. What is the single greatest threat to your health and safety at work? I mean, most of us probably immediately picture something highly visible, right? Maybe something heavily regulated by an occupational safety board.
We naturally fear obvious physical hazards, slippery floors, dangerous machinery, toxic chemicals, things like that. And while those are absolutely crucial to watch out for, researchers argue that for most workers today, the worst kind of harm actually arises from faulty human relations. In fact, Montreal researcher Hans Selye actually won a Nobel Prize for defining the modern workplace's ultimate illness with just one word: stress. And the phenomenon we're looking at today? It's literally considered the stressor to beat all stressors.
All right, Section 1, the virus, defining the threat.
When Heinz Lehmann identified this distinct menace in the early 80s, while exploring what were supposedly some of the safest workplaces in the world, mind you, he chose the English word mobbing. And listen, this isn't just your standard office conflict. It is an impassioned collective campaign. It's when coworkers actually gang up to exclude, punish, and humiliate a single targeted worker. It's really like a virus. It starts with one person, usually someone with a bit of influence, who feels this desperate urge to just crush the target. And then that urge infects one person after another until the target is viewed by the entire group as totally abhorrent, stripped of all their redeeming qualities, and basically deserving only of contempt.
Now, you might be sitting there thinking, wait, isn't this just bullying? But there is a very distinct difference here. Bullying is often one-on-one, and it can be overtly aggressive or even physical. Mobbing, on the other hand, is deeply collective. It actually mimics bureaucratic processes. It's often carried out politely, with ample written documentation and formal meetings. But make no mistake, the source material describes this as bloodlust without the blood. It relies entirely on group solidarity against someone they have all secretly agreed simply doesn't belong.
What's truly shocking about all this is the sheer scale of complicity. Lehmann and other experts estimate that only about 2 to 5% of adults will actually be mobbed during their working lives. Think about what that means. That means the vast majority of us, the other 95%, will interact with this virus as observers, bystanders, or, uncomfortable as it is to admit, even perpetrators. And because it's human nature to kind of gloss over or completely deny our part in collective cruelty, this hidden epidemic has managed to stay largely in the shadows.
Moving on to Section 2, Anatomy of an Attack, the Factory Worker.
To really understand how this virus takes hold, we need to look at a real-world example. We're going to look at a factory worker who was initially and incorrectly thought to just be experiencing sexual harassment. Now, this woman found herself at the absolute bottom of the workplace pecking order because of 3 very specific vulnerabilities that isolated her. First, she had a partial disability from an old workplace accident, which meant she couldn't rotate through all the heavy physical tasks her peers did. Second, she was an ethnic minority of 1 within her specific workgroup. And third, she was deeply devoted to her faith and her family, meaning she just didn't participate in the coarse, expletive, heavy banter that the rest of the factory floor really thrived on. Basically, she was different, and that difference made her a target.
So how does it escalate? Well, it happens in distinct, terrifying steps. A male coworker actually began the harassment with insults and sexual slurs. But, crucially, it didn't stay with him. This guy was charismatic. He even supplied other workers with tax-free cigarettes, which helped him forge these secret alliances. He basically acted as the chief eliminator. Soon enough, his hostile ploys infected the other workers. And here's the really tragic part. Every single time the targeted woman appealed to management or her union, she failed. Why? Because management was suddenly faced with overturning the collective will of an increasingly unified, angry mob that simply wanted her gone.
Which brings us to the devastating breaking point. On a hot summer day, as job assignments were rotating, a female coworker actually shouted out, "I don't want to work with the cripple."
Another worker completely refused to give her a sweatband, claiming she didn't work hard enough to earn one. The collective hostility was finally out in the open. This poor veteran worker completely broke down, crying uncontrollably. She was rushed to the hospital, diagnosed with clinical depression, and later even suffered a severe heart attack. It took 10 long years, but the mobbing campaign effectively robbed her of her health and her dignity.
Section 3. The trapped target. Why not just quit? Listening to this, you're probably asking the exact same question most people do in these scenarios. If the torment is so relentless, why on earth doesn't the target just quit? Well, the great irony of workplace mobbing is where it actually happens. You'd think it thrives in chaotic, unprotected jobs, right? But it's actually the exact opposite. In at-will workplaces, if a group hates a worker, the manager usually just fires them or the worker leaves. Mobbing is surprisingly rare there. But in highly secure workplaces, think union shops, university faculties with tenure, or police forces, you can't just fire someone without cause. So if the group hates them, but there are zero legal grounds for termination, the conflict metastasizes into this long-term, incredibly devious campaign to just mentally wear the person down.
So the crucial takeaway here is that the most vulnerable person is actually often a high achiever who is deeply invested in a secure job. They unwittingly threaten or shame the group, usually just by doing their job really well. The source material likens this situation to grabbing a hot wire. The targeted worker has invested so much of their personal identity into the job and feels so deeply wronged by the harassment that they simply cannot let go, no matter how much psychological voltage is coursing through them.
And that leads us to Section 4, the fallout and the future.
This kind of deep psychological entrenchment forces us to look at the absolute worst-case scenarios, the moments where the target finally snaps. Back in 1999 at OC Transpo in Ottawa, a worker named Pierre Lebrun had been relentlessly ridiculed by his coworkers for a stutter. When he finally lashed out and slapped one of his tormentors, management actually forced him to apologize to the very people who had been mocking him. The overwhelming humiliation of that moment culminated in Lebrun returning to work, tragically killing 4 people and then taking his own life. It was an absolute tragedy, entirely born from a preventable culture of collective cruelty.
Now, while mass violence is incredibly rare, the quiet devastation is, unfortunately, incredibly common. The health impacts of mobbing are just severe. Before Lyman's clinical work, a lot of mobbing victims who suffered mental breakdowns were actually misdiagnosed with paranoid delusions. I mean, doctors simply couldn't fathom that a whole office was genuinely out to get one person. But it's not just psychiatric. Targets often succumb to cardiovascular diseases like hypertension and stroke, alongside complete social isolation and marital breakdown.
So, the million-dollar question, how do we fix it? Well, the solution isn't quite as simple as just writing up a new rule. While many organizations are actively enacting anti-mobbing policies intended to punish this behavior, researchers issue a pretty stark warning here. These policies can very easily be weaponized. Just as the mob mimics bureaucracy to push someone out, they can literally use a shiny new anti-mobbing policy as a tool to formally convict, punish, and humiliate an innocent target. It's a real double-edged sword.
The impulse to gang up on someone who is different, to find solidarity through a common enemy, it is an undeniably dark yet deeply embedded part of human nature. And you can't simply outlaw human nature, right? So I want to leave you with this final thought to take away from our explainer today. Now that you can actually recognize the quiet, polite, highly bureaucratic virus of workplace mobbing, what steps are you going to take, whether as an observer, a bystander, or a leader, to keep your workplace safe from the darker side of human nature?